Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Buzzanco and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin, in Berkeley, California today on New Year's Eve, New Year's Eve 2024. And as always, I am joined by
Bob Buzzanco in Houston, Texas, and happy Green and Red New Year. Have a Green and Red New Year. Everybody should have a Green and Red New Year.
Everyone should have a Green and Red New Year. It's the end of the year. This is our end of the year episode. We always do an end of the year episode to talk about the year that was. But before we do that, I think we're going to kick off with just our merch drop. So we've said this in some previous episodes. We have hats, $25 plus shipping and $25, which includes shipping and handling, and you get a green and red trucker hat. And then Bob is holding up a copy of Masters of War, which is Bob's first book. And if you send us $25, you can get an autographed copy of Masters of War from Professor Robert Buzzanco. And then the other, while they last, is the Certain Days calendar, the Political Prisoner Support Project, which we're good comrades with. We also, with the $25 donation, we also will send you a copy of a calendar. So just email us at greenredpodcast@gmail, and we'll set you up. We'll get an address and we'll give you the donate link and all that sort of stuff. And with that being said, on with the show. And so to kick off today, it's like we said, and as you're watching it, it's, December 31st, 2024. 2 days ago, former President Jimmy Carter died at the age of 100. We have been doing shows on Jimmy Carter for a long time, not since the very beginning of the show, but since 2021, we have talked a lot about the history and politics of the Carter administration. It should be noted that we think Jimmy Carter was a very decent human being, and his post-presidency was something that not just ex-president should aspire to, but all of us should aspire to. And I think I maybe said aspire to. And he was a great humanitarian. He built homes with Habitat for Humanity for the homeless. He initiated the democracy program through the Carter Center, which helped bring fair and clean elections in 100 different countries. He helped eradicate disease in Africa. And then most importantly, and this is very important to a lot of people like Bob and I and people on the left, is that he had a very vocal opposition to Israeli apartheid of Palestinians, to the point where the story goes is in 2008, he was supposed to speak at the Democratic National Convention, and Alan Dershowitz got him axed off the speaker's list because he was so pro-Palestine. And so we're going to talk about Jimmy Carter a little bit, and then we have some other things we're going to talk about as well.
Yeah, the Carter thing was important because, as you said, he's been really inspirational. But what we've done, and I've written articles about it as well, we've done podcasts, is point out that as president, Carter was an American president. He ushered in neoliberalism, really was no friend to labor, especially when you started to see the first phase of deindustrialization in places like Youngstown and Pittsburgh and Cleveland and Detroit and elsewhere. And Carter didn't support workers in that regard. He somehow either encouraged or paid China to invade Vietnam, which is important. He supported the apartheid forces of South Africa against the Angolan resistance. He did not support the Timorese against Indonesia. And as you pointed out, I could spend tons of time on him. And I'll actually be doing some media on him in the coming days. So if you catch it, you'll get a little bit more about this. But I think most importantly, as you pointed out, he wrote a book, which I used in my class when it came out for about 3 or 4 different years. So a lot of students read it, called Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid, which using that word today we do, and we still catch hell for it. But to do that 20 some years ago was really pretty striking. He did human rights work and won a Nobel Prize for brokering a deal with North Korea at the time. I think this is important because this isn't just like shit on the guy because he's dead or to be like hip or whatever. It just says a lot about the way power is structured in the US. And I think it's instructive for the Bernie fans, especially, who rely on people and personalities and these kind of individuals. And Carter is a decent human. And I think we knew that when he ran for president. I think that was the kind of the story was this is a decent guy, not a wealthy man at all, probably the poorest president and probably the poorest ex-president too. Look at the way Obama and Clinton's have raked it in. They're like probably $500 million range, right? And Trump was just the most corrupt piece of shit ever. And Carter didn't do that at all. So no matter what, like you can be the most decent human in the world, but once you're president, it just doesn't matter. Carter, remember, we talked about this. We talked about this with Noam too, when we talked about why the Democrats suck, right? Carter was a product of the Trilateral Commission. He emerged as a Democratic player 4 years earlier in 1972 when he and Scoop Jackson tried at the Democratic Convention to deny McGovern the nomination. So he came up in a very different way than what we learned about him later. And that's the thing, that you can't count on these people. What's the Springsteen line? Waste your summer praying in vain for a savior to rise from these streets. And I think that's what the Bernie people did too. And had Bernie Sanders become president, I'm not saying he would have done the things Carter did or rejected labor or whatever, but you weren't going to get a kind of route. And we've seen that, right? Because look at the way Sanders more or less capitulated to Biden, right? And he did that as a senator. You can imagine as president, he would have probably been buffeted by all these forces. The right wing has no problem looking you in the eye, telling you to go fuck yourself, and telling you that they don't care if your kids eat or they get a school lunch or you have a house, or they don't care, right? And the Democratic Party just bends over backwards not to alienate people. And in the end, of course, end up punching left, as we've pointed out here a million times. Carter, I mean, amazing guy. Oh, go ahead.
It should be noted that after Carter was president, and as the Democrats were moving rightward, Carter eventually, as I pointed out from 2008, became one of the targets when they punched left.
Yeah. And he's in American politics, he's left. He is, as much as Sanders is.
Yep.
Actually, more. I've never heard Bernie Sanders use the word apartheid or genocide. Maybe I missed it, right? But Carter, I think, was on issues like Palestine, was definitely to the left of all of these Democrats, including Sanders and the squad. But he lived a great life, right? He did good stuff. He traveled all over. He brought joy to people. He built houses. What a funny story. Off talking about really. One time, somebody was asking him why his house, those Habitat for Humanity houses are really solid. And somebody asked him why. And he said, because we use hammers and nails. Because now construction is just like boom, and it's made this like cheap ass particle board and shit like that. He was just a decent human. Oh, I don't know if you noticed, but I think you told me actually, our governor here, Greg Abbott, sent condolences to Roseland.
Who died in
last year,
2023.
And he sent condolences to her.
It just says a lot about the state of Republican politics and how they just don't care about anything.
Yeah. I wonder if Trump will be at the funeral.
No, I'm sure he will be.
Yeah. Jeez. But at any rate, check it out. We'll put it in the show notes. I wrote a couple articles, actually, one on my blog, which is afflictthecomfortable.org, and one in Counterpunch, which I think is a little more extensive. We've done shows on it. We've talked about it a lot.
And we just reposted our episode from 2021, like fresh on all the channels.
But I've noticed like there's been a spate of lefties this week coming out with Jimmy Carter wasn't so great. I think we did that 4 years ago, and in a way more nuanced way, and I think in a way more kind of legitimate way. The stuff I wrote, especially, that's based on government documents. It's not just me sitting up there pontificating and thinking because I'm from Brooklyn, I'm smarter than all of you. So, hey, it's my last shot to get a shot in 2024. So
yeah, it's your last shot. It's your last 2024 shot.
My last 2024 shot at the Brooklyn Boys. So, anyway, but Jimmy Carter, I remember, and I'm horribly name dropping here, but actually I was chatting to Noam Chomsky about this once because we were talking about this stuff, and he was amazed by Carter and felt the same way. I think he really had an admirable life. And I said, I can't think of anybody else who's done this. Maybe George Kennan a little. And he said McNamara, kind of, because McNamara did become an outspoken critic of like nuclear war and NATO and stuff like that. But really, this is pretty rare. And Carter is unmatched in that regard. Mm-hmm. Kennan on foreign policy issues actually became quite good. Mm-hmm. And toward the end started to sound like he was a new left professor or something like that on foreign policy issues. But and then you have other establishment people, but Kennan was very important, a diplomat. I think it's really cool to look at his life, but also to understand that if somebody becomes president, what you get is Jimmy Carter's presidency, which was dismal, truly dismal, just a disaster. He continued to support the Shah until way too late, which eventually sets in motion what will become the hostage crisis, which ended up ruining his presidency as much as anything else. Wicked inflation, the oil shocks, just all kinds of stuff that he could not handle. And I think it's really important too. He's the first kind of neoliberal president. He's big on deregulation.
He also, Nixon and Kissinger and Ford had been moving us more towards détente with the Soviets, and Carter and Brzezinski actually are the ones who derailed that. And they actually are, it wasn't Reagan who began the more confrontational stance with the Russians. It was actually Carter and Brzezinski and Vance and all of that crew as well.
Here's a fact, which liberals, every time I say it, they just say that never happened. But here's a fact. It's real. I knew this when it happened because I used to follow that shit, right? Carter is the first person to fund the resistance in Nicaragua, the Contras. He also went to the OAS to try to get a multilateral force established to prevent the Sandinistas from taking over the government in July of 1979. And he also essentially created the resistance in Afghanistan, who became like Mujahideen and Al-Qaeda, Taliban, and all that kind of stuff. And there's an amazing video of, you mentioned Brzezinski. Brzezinski went to the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan in December, probably like on this date, maybe like 45 years ago. And he's talking to these fighters, these Mujahideen, who the United States will support with billions of dollars in service to air missiles and all that kind of stuff. And Brzezinski and Carter sent him there, obviously. And Brzezinski says, you're going to get this land back. Those are your mosques, and Allah is on your side, right? Which is ironic, right? Because you have this anti-Muslim hysteria, but the United States is actually playing that up. That was the basis of the resistance. That's how Carter's doing. It really is. He did not support Humphrey Hawkins, which was a bill to create a mandatory cap on unemployment in America, to enhance aid and things like that. Carter, really, we usually say the New Deal kind of ended with Reagan in 1980. That was kind of the end of the New Deal era. But you can really bump it up to January 20th, 1977, when Carter took office. That's, I think, when you start to see the New Deal really begin to fall apart. As president, honestly, I think like Biden is as much a New Deal liberal as Carter ever was 40 years later. But especially on foreign policy, he was a war criminal, and he just was. And he, if anybody ever atoned for what he did, it was him. I hope he, as we say, presente James Earl Carter, and hopefully what he did after January 20th, 1981. Will really stick, and people will say that those kinds of worlds are possible. They're not easy, they're harder than ever, but they are possible.
I think we're going to do a little bit of our year in review, and the way in which we've decided to structure our year in review is talk about some of our favorite episodes. And so Bob and I have put together our top 5 each, I guess you could say, of episodes. And so we're gonna talk about that.
Yeah, we had some overlaps. I think we've changed them so we can have be a little more diverse lists. And keep in mind, it's hard to pick a top 5 because they're all so freaking great.
Because we're awesome podcasters.
But yeah, just go ahead and we could chat about them. And they're not, in my case, I'm just going to give them like actually chronological order in which we did them. But yeah, sure.
Yeah, the one I'm going to kick off with is an interview I did in the fall with Eugene Perrier, who was with Breakthrough News. I talked to Eugene a day or two after the Israelis had launched attacks on Lebanon. Eugene is a longtime activist, longtime organizer, longtime journalist, he's built up Breakthrough News with a couple of other people. Eugene also has written quite extensively about the links between the Black Liberation Movement and the Palestine Liberation Movement. Around the DNC, the Democratic National Convention back in August, he actually talked a lot about the 1964 Mississippi Freedom Party actually doing a protest at the 1964 DNC, which I think was in Atlantic City, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And so it was actually a really good conversation. Eugene had a really good take on the link between different struggles in the U.S. and then the struggle with the Palestinians.
Like I said, I'm just going in actually reverse chronological order since we're starting with 5. And so we did a great interview with somebody who I admire a great deal, who's Bev Stoll. Bev was Noam Chomsky's assistant for like 20 years, I think, or more than 20 years, actually. And since Noam has taken ill and really hasn't been public for a year and a half now, Bev wrote a memoir about that called Chomsky and Me. And it was just really great chatting with her about what it was like. And it really humanized him in ways that I think are important because everybody knows him as this amazing intellect, smartest guy ever in a lot of ways. And so to talk to Bev about it was really cool and just humanize this guy and made us realize, since we haven't had him around for in over a year now, just what he's meant to so many of us. That show with Bev was really fantastic.
Yeah, it was great. It was actually great to talk to Bev. Hopefully we'll have
Yeah.
her again on sometime.
Yeah,
my fourth one, which is I will say that this fall we launched a couple of series. One of those series was our arts and culture series. We've done a bunch of episodes. We have more episodes in the works on this. And I think all of our arts and culture stuff was great. I will say I'm going to just talk about the one that I enjoyed the most, which I put at number 4, which was our episode where we talked about Mad Men and capitalism. We dove deep into the show. I would say we had a lot of fun with that, but I also will say that it's interesting how when we use pop culture to sort of dissect the politics, dissect what's going on in the world, and Mad Men is a really great way to do that. If you're familiar with the show, if you're not, you should watch it and look at it through this more like left political lens, because it has a lot of critiques on race, gender, all that, which is the sort of more obvious stuff, but the critiques on capitalism is very insightful.
Yeah. The other two were the Milagro Beanfield War and Kris Kristofferson, which were quite good also. And the Mad Men one was one of the most viewed episodes last year too. I don't know if it was number 1. I don't think it was, but it was way up there. So
and then there's also the Alan Moore episode I did, which was part of
yeah,
yeah.
And yeah, and like you said, we have more coming up about movies and TV and things like that. My fourth is Yanis Varoufakis. Not because we talked to him about his new book, which is all about the cloud and
tech feudalism,
stuff like that. Not because I actually don't buy it at all. But it was just got to admit, from a personal level, this guy was a Greek finance minister, and he's very well known. And it's just very cool. And you probably feel this way too. A working class kid from Ohio, and I'm sitting here talking to people like that about their work. And I thought that was very cool. Although I disagree with this. I think he's done a lot of good and important stuff in the past. He's very well known. And I just really it was cool to talk to him about that. We probably could have nudged him a little bit more, but I've listened to, in preparation for that, I listened to a lot of podcasts. And so I was really happy with the way ours turned out. And it was just neat in the course of your life to be able to have communication with somebody like that.
Yeah. And he was a great guest too. I will say.
Yeah, he really was. He really
was. And then my number 3, which I think is also going to make Bob's list, was we talked with Professor Richard Slotkin, who is a hero to both of us in a sense. Very much love the works of Richard Slotkin. He's a historian and cultural critic. He's known for a lot of works talking about violence and the history of the West, the Western United States, and then the frontier and things like that. He actually had a new book out that he's put that is really a sort of commentary on Trump more than anything else. But Professor Slotkin frames everything in the form of like narratives, and there's the narrative of the frontier, and there's the narrative of the founding of the U.S. But importantly, for what this moment we are now in United States history, is the narrative of the lost cause, which is about the Confederacy and how Trump really embraced that. Anyway, it was a great conversation with Professor Slotkin.
Yeah, I didn't include that because I knew you had it on there. And
you didn't? Okay.
No, I did, but I didn't I'm not going to say it because you had it on yours. So I just figured I would give me a chance to talk about something else. But
yeah,
Slotkin, I don't know no, I'm sure I read Slotkin first. I believe it. I was still in grad school, but I know I assigned all of his books in my grad courses. And because he's talking about culture and movies and myths and things like that, I think the students always responded really well to it. Yeah, he has a lot of important stuff to say. That was great. This one, I can never do just 5. I was cheap. This one is actually a compilation, and it's the stuff we've done on the Middle East. And because we've done a lot on that, but in particular, I talked with 2 fantastic scholars who I happen to know as well, Eskander Sadeghi Borjardi and Nathaniel George, about Iran and Lebanon. And I think twice each, I believe. And that was really important because one thing we've been stressing, even before October 7th, 2023, is how Israel is aggressive in the entire region. And so having them on really put it into this really a larger regional context, which was great. Talking about Iran, talking about Lebanon, talking about Israel's imperialism and war crimes and atrocities. And then also, and if I were going to pick one for the whole year, this might have actually been number 1. On the anniversary of October 7th, talked to Fadi Kafiti, who is a PhD student and also a really important activist. And we talked about what October 7th meant, what's happened since then. And it was just a really incredible show, very powerful, an unapologetic defense of the Palestinian people, which we need all the time. I would say just those kind of generally those Middle Eastern shows, especially with Iskander and Nate and Fadi, were really important. And we're going to obviously do more of that, unfortunately, in the coming year. I have a couple of people we're working on right now. But this is I think I'm old enough to have actually talked to people who are in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. And just to hear their voices and to see their eyes when they talked about it as like the issue of their day. And Palestine, Gaza is bigger than that. And that's what we have to make it the issue of our day. I'm not saying there's a lot of important stuff going on and we're getting pummeled from 18 different sides. But what's happening at Gaza is really one of the just most vicious crimes against humanity, clearly in my lifetime. I think it would be that and the Khmer Rouge. Not that people will laugh and say, oh, you're being hyperbole. I don't think so. I don't think that's hyperbole. I think Netanyahu is essentially Pol Pot, right? And Biden is too. Although the United States supported the Khmer Rouge, and who the president was who supported the Khmer Rouge first?
Jimmy Carter.
James Earl Carter. That's right. The United States supported the Khmer Rouge for the seat at the UN after they were overthrown by a Vietnamese-backed movement with Hun Sen. Both Carter and Reagan had the Khmer Rouge back. So anyway, but that's neither here nor there. But that's the moral issue today. Anyway, the Mideast stuff was really important, I think.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Very important. And then my number two is a little bit more of a history, people's history, where it was around Judy Berry Day. Judy Berry was a Earth Firster. Her along with another Earth Firster named Daryl Cherney were actually bombed here in Oakland, California. And we spoke with Karen Pickett, who was a friend of Judy and Daryl, still is a friend of Daryl's. Judy's passed away in 1997, and it's a longtime Earth First organizer. We actually went deep into the history of the Timber Wars and into the background of Judy Berry. It was a really great, informative episode, and always love to lift up the sort of the episodes in the history of environmental resistance in the U.S., particularly in the Northwest. I've wanted to interview Karen for a long time.
Yeah, that was great. And again, we have to keep these things alive. Second, it's another series, which is the shows we've done pretty recently on the WTO. On November 30th, 1999 was the now famous Battle of Seattle. And so we decided to do a retrospective on that. And it's really cool to me because as a professor, it's something I followed closely, this kind of whole issue of globalization. It's important as a historian to get it out. And then personally, we actually did a show on this. It was really important in my own personal kind of evolution. And Scott and I, that's how we met. We began to do organizing together. We did a series, I think it was 6 shows, I believe. And there's a backgrounder where I talk a little bit about the global economy. And then we interviewed some really great people who were very active in that. I don't remember the
Nancy
names.
Hawk,
Nancy
Chris
Hawk,
Dixon,
and Kevin Danaher, of course. And then we did our piece about how we took what had happened in Seattle and ran with it in Houston. And then we have an epilogue from an interview we did earlier with Lisa Sachs, just about how globalization is still around, right? And I think this is really important. And it's really important, I think, now, especially in light of American politics, because and the media just doesn't want to deal with this. I think that's one of the really important driving forces behind the rise of Trump and MAGA America, right? NAFTA and the WTO and those institutions have really badly damaged the American economy, especially in working class areas. And I think that's the major reason. And polling data confirms that. The major reason you've seen a lot of shifts from blue to red is because of the impact that these globalization policies had. And again, keep in mind, these were policies pursued by everybody, and I would argue even more strongly by Clinton and Obama, the Democrats.
Yeah, I want to point out that one thing that we knew, but that really emerged out of our conversations on the WTO series. Also, I didn't put this in my list, but I'd actually talked with David Solnit about the anniversary of a book he wrote called Global. But it's important that actually the importance of NAFTA and how it has derailed American politics, and a lot of that originated going back to who, Bob?
James Earl Carter.
Right. And there's a classic picture which has actually come up, which is where Clinton is signing NAFTA, and standing right behind him is Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, and George H.W. Bush.
There's a book that I didn't realize has already been published by David Gibbs about kind of the rise of neoliberalism and the shift in America to the right, which I believe Columbia Press put out. I have to get a hold of it. I actually read it when it was being reviewed. And it's Carter's really prominent in that too, like how important he was to things like globalization and deregulation, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, that was but I love that. Just talking to those people was really cool. Talking to Doniger again, who I met in that era. And it's just important history. And I think if you want to understand American politics, we can sit around and have these, I think, mindfuck games about woke mental, what is it, the woke mind virus, and DEI statements and canceling and all that. And those are parlor games. Those are smoke screens. And I think things like the WTO and NAFTA and the abundant resistance to them, which occurred in many ways. It required a great deal of intense organizing, but it also had an organic component to it where people just said, okay, we've had enough, which, I mean, I would argue that's what we're seeing in this particular moment with the healthcare industry, right? Yeah. One act has really unleashed the furies. But the WTO stuff, I would certainly, and we'll put links to all these in the notes too.
I think it's also important to note that the healthcare sector sort of isn't powered and emboldened also with the deregulation, the corporate deregulation that we see coming out, particularly the Clinton years. We see it also in George Bush and Obama, et cetera. And we also all know that Obama gave the healthcare industry one of their biggest bonanzas, which was, Obamacare, which is basically like corporate insurance.
No, it's socialist healthcare.
Socialism. It's socialism.
It's ruining us all. If you get sick, if you get a cold, you're going to have to wait 6 months to go to the doctor. Unlike today, when you get in immediately, and they're going to pay for it, they pay. It's ridiculous, right? But anyway, that was. And
so I'm going to go with my number one. I don't want to say it's my favorite episode, but I think it's one of the more important episodes we did of the year because it's not on a very happy topic. But it's there's an episode that Bob and I did with our friend and comrade Clayton Lust, I believe late April, early May, and it was around the campus occupations. The campus occupations, in my mind, is one of the more significant stories of 2024. It's what derailed the Biden presidency. It showed the liberal state for what it was.
Yep.
And we see liberal university administrators at Ivy League colleges. We see Democratic mayors and Democratic governors sending in the shock troops against kids who are peacefully camping out on campus. They have tents, right? And yet we see this harsh reaction in places like New York City and Los Angeles. To be fair, we also see it happen in Austin and Texas because Greg Abbott is a fetid piece of garbage.
Columbus, Ohio.
Snipers
on buildings here.
Yeah, and the three of us broke down that moment. We also talked about how it's the similarities between that and 1968, where we saw these student uprisings, particularly at Columbia. And it's just like an important issue. I really encourage everyone to listen to it. We've talked about that episode in other venues. We talked about it when we were on This Is Revolution the other day, but it's something that kind of keeps coming back because the campus occupations and the crackdown by the liberal state, not the right wingers, it was quite important.
Yeah. And there's so much about that that's important. And it shows that there's still resistance out there, that people haven't given up. But I think that last point is something that I always, try to make prominent because everybody's afraid of Trump with good reason. He's terribly frightening and he will do a lot of harm. And you can already see that with these proposals to give the Treasury Department the right to revoke nonprofit status for certain groups, and those will be groups that we support, not the Proud Boys and the NRA and groups like that, right? And that's a legitimate fear, but the Democratic Party is every bit as complicit. Actually, since they held the White House, they're even more complicit in this, right? But you've seen this like Biden, and I think attended with that is the kind of use of the allegations of slurs of anti-Semitism against people. And Biden is there's a ferocious anti-Semitism. And that is so filthy. That is, to me, far worse than calling Harris and Biden socialists, because that's observably silly. And I wish they were socialists, but to label somebody anti-Semitic is really filthy. And Buchel did that. Eric Adams did that. Gavin Newsom, the great liberal savior, was no friend of the student protesters. We've seen violence used against these protesters who are peaceful. They're unarmed too. There's never been a single instance where anybody said, oh, they have guns or anything. And so we've seen, this is how the state operates, right? They'll sit outside while some crazy, guy blows up a school in Uvalde, shoots up a school in Uvalde. They do nothing. They sit around with their things in the dark, holding their hands, right? But like that scene of The Godfather, don't let him come out there with just his dick in his hand. That's what the Uvalde police did, right?
Right.
So they have no issue with that, right? But God forbid you protest with words and signs and put up a tent challenging the power of Israel, right? And yeah, that's just such an important issue. It's such a main.
It should also be noted that when there was a gang of Zionists that attacked the student occupation at UCLA, they did just stand by and let it happen.
Paid for by Jerry Seinfeld.
Yeah, and his wife.
Yeah.
Same thing.
Yeah. Top one, actually similar to yours, plays off something bigger than that. And I'm not going to name Luigi the person of the year, but Luigi clearly has awakened us. One act has really created an amazing dynamic in America. And it fit in perfectly because once again, we are on top of things. We are ahead of the loop. About 6 weeks ago, we interviewed Dr. Stephen Bezruchka on this very topic. He wrote a book called Inequality Kills Us All. And we had this fantastic conversation about American healthcare industry, their profits, the amount of money spent, the lack of care. We get all the things that we're talking about now after Luigi. Bezruchka's book covered. It is an important book. It's a hugely important topic. We should all be reading that right now. And he should be in charge of whatever Bobby Kennedy or RFK Jr. is in charge of or whatever. And that one, I would have had it in the top 5 because that was a great interview. But after Luigi's Mangione, I really think it's, in many ways, I think along with the Columbia one, which is great too, but I think the Bezruchka interview is really important. And I think there's just such great data in there. And that's the thing, like with many issues we believe in, if you look at the data, it's not a hard call. It's not a hard decision. And yet the Democratic Party, they're either genuflecting before these corporations and banks and so forth, or they're just afraid. And there's overwhelming support for some kind of serious change in the healthcare system, just like there's always been overwhelming support for abortion rights and for gun regulation,
raising the minimum
wages and Medicare expansion and everything else. And yet the Democratic Party runs on the narrative. We could have done that. We could talk about that the whole time, right? But the Democratic Party's narrative is we were too far to the left. We were too extreme. The left wing killed us, right? And so you have a party now that's going to listen to the likes of Eric Adams and John Fetterman, two really disgusting, dismal humans who just deserve nothing. They deserve no fucking sucker from us, right? They're more willing to listen to them than the millions and millions of people who have gone into bankruptcy or even died because the healthcare system is so rancid. Or they don't listen to the parents of the Uvalde students. They don't listen to these women who now, the infant mortality rate in Texas rose by 12.8%. And in Texas, they're finding last year they had, I forget the number of babies, like newborns, abandoned, dead. On all of these issues, our views really have solid support. And yet the Democratic Party runs against them, which is why, especially going forward, this electoral stuff got to stop. I hate to sound like I'm from Brooklyn and tell everybody what to do, but this focus on the election, let's prepare for the election. I mean, you can prepare for elections. That's what you've been doing. And the world just gets worse and worse and worse. That's the part that I don't understand. Like the Republican Party, like in Texas, let's say, right? They still blame liberals for everything. There hasn't been a Democrat in public office here since the late 90s. There's been one. I think it was the Attorney General for 2 years when I first moved here, right?
Pete Morales.
Or was it? Yeah, was that his name? Or wasn't there a Sanchez who was something too? Anyway. So in all of these cases, we have these positions that most people abide by, and yet we get nowhere. And like the Democratic Party, Pelosi, look at the money over the years she's taken from healthcare companies, Schumer, Biden, all of them. In both when Clinton attempted a healthcare reform in '93, and then again, obviously more successful with Obama. In both cases, any kind of like public healthcare system was never even considered. It was off the table. And they created a private system which mandates the purchase of a private service. So this was a gift to the to the health insurance companies, right? And so the Bezruchka thing is really great. It's really important, as so many of these were. So
yeah, I would definitely encourage people to check out that episode. It's somewhat serendipitous that we did that episode about 6 weeks before Luigi Mangione took his action.
Yeah. And then I think we both have a few honorable mentions, which I'll just mention, which the Slockett one, but we already talked about that. We did one, which to me was a lot of fun because it's something I talk about a lot, which was about baseball and economics, baseball and capitalism, right before the World Series, because the two wealthiest teams, the Yankees and Dodgers, were playing. So that was a lot of fun. Our interview with Dennis Bernstein, who is one of my favorite people. He is a longtime host of Flashpoints on KPFA. Just told us these mesmerizing stories about working in journalism, Iran Contra, with Robert Knight, with Gary Webb, with Robert Perry. And if you're in the Bay Area, and even if you're not, you should want to fly out to see this on January.
And we're streaming too.
Oh, we're streaming it. Oh, cool. On January 16th, we're doing an event in is it Berkeley or San Francisco?
We're doing it's at the Berkeley Unitarian Universalist Fellowship.
Okay, and Dennis will be on our panel, and so we're really looking forward to that. The episode, you mentioned the episode on Med. We talked to Charles Glass about Julian Assange, which I think really that was always troubling to see how the left didn't. No, not everybody, but a lot of people like liberals on the left just ignored Assange. They wouldn't go anywhere near him, and so we talked to Charlie Glass about that, which I think was really important. It was really cool. Really, one of the highlights of the year was that Assange was finally back in Australia. Was he pardoned? No, he wasn't pardoned. He was commuted, right? And then we also spoke, which was personally one of my favorites too, somebody I've known a long time who was actually a student of mine, Roy Vu, who is a professor and just wrote a book on gardens in Vietnamese communities in Houston. He's a specialist on immigration, and that was really cool. It was really fun talking to Roy. He's a really bright young guy, and we got a great feedback and a lot of views on that. And so those would be my honorable mentions. I could add 20 more to it.
The only other ones I would throw into my honorable mentions is I did an interview with Adam Fetterman, who's an independent journalist, and we talked about the FBI's war on the anti-pipeline movement during the 2010s. We talked with Tom Zaitzoff, who's a friend and professor at American University, about political violence, which was actually a very interesting conversation. And then we talked with our a frequent guest, Graham Klumpner, about the self-immolation of Aaron Bushnell and opposition and resistance to the conflict, the genocide in Gaza within military ranks, which I think was very important as well.
Yeah. No, it's great stuff. Like I said, we could add so many more to it. Another thing we always do, and we'll be quick with this, is just briefly mention, because everybody does this, it's like obligatory. I think if you're going to have a podcast, I think you have to do this, which is to talk about the people who died in the past year, the people we've lost. And we should have planned ahead of time. We could have done like the Academy Awards and had some music in the background, and we could have shown their pictures and all that kind of stuff. And we talked about a few of these when they happened, but a lot
did whole episodes.
Yeah, Kris Kristofferson comes to mind. We did a whole episode on Kristofferson, who was, obviously a great artist, but really a powerful activist who didn't back down and supported the farm workers, and he supported Palestine, and he just really had a really important life. It was a tough year in country music. I think Kinky Friedman, who wasn't really a lefty, but did run for governor of Texas against, I believe it was Rick Perry, and had some decent ideas, but a good artist. He died this year too. I'm sure you have people, and we have a whole list there. So.
And the other episode of a person who passed away that we did, it was brief, and I did it, was Jane McAlevey, who was a longtime union organizer, but also like an educator, and actually started a project, wrote a number of books, wrote a number of books, and started a project basically to educate organizers on how to organize to win. And Jane was a pretty significant figure, and particularly in union circles. She died last summer. And I encourage people to listen to that episode, but also check out Jane's books, because I would actually say she's not just been influential on labor organizers, but I know a lot of environmental organizers and social justice organizers who also have really taken a lot from her teachings and her writings and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Just more recently, Nikki Giovanni just died a couple of weeks ago, famous poet. James Earl Jones, a famous actor and activist, very active, especially in the civil rights movement. There's so many more.
The other significant one, who was a pretty prominent actor, who was also an activist, a new left activist in the late 60s and early 70s, who passed away, is Donald Sutherland.
Yeah,
who did a lot of anti-war work, and during Vietnam, during Iraq, did a lot of fuck the war tours.
Yeah, very active. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess, and then on a personal level, somebody, and I think we talked about this when it happened, was Phil Donahue, who, was really, I think, in many ways, the first, very, not the first, because if you actually look at old talk shows like Jack Paar and stuff like that, they would have on like, kind of politicians and intellectuals and things like that. And Donahue, I think, brought that to a new level. He talked about things that a lot of people on TV weren't going to talk about. It wasn't like the kind of whole Jerry Springer, Maury Povich kind of craziness. He had really serious and important guests on, and he was canceled in, what was it, 2003 for opposing the American war, the American invasion of Iraq.
Canceled off of MSNBC.
Yeah. There's a whole story. We should do more on that. Oh, which I forgot, Greg Shupak. I should have included that. Greg studies the media coverage, especially of Palestine and Israel. So that's a great show too, right? But MSNBC got rid of, who was the guy? Mehdi Hassan, was that who it was?
Yeah, they got rid of Mehdi Hassan.
Mehdi Hassan, right? But those were good. And there was just some great people this year. Willie Mays, if you're a baseball fan, who also had an important role to play, right? William Cowley, I'm just looking at the list. Bill Walton, who was kind of a cultural icon, deadhead,
The other I think the last one I'll say is the other countercultural icon who passed away this year was Alice Brock, who actually in the song, who's the inspiration for the song Alice's Restaurant by Arlo Guthrie, and I think Bob and I are both fans of that song, and I think she was an important icon in the counterculture. You can get anything you want at Alice's Restaurant, except for Alice.
I've spent a fair amount of time in the Berkshires, and people still talked about her, and they knew her. It was funny, the place where I was staying, like I would take walks every day, and I kept going by this house, and the mailbox had a name on it, Oppenheim, right? And it wasn't until the last day there, and it was like, Officer Obie's family was his kids. So that legacy still lives on. Years ago, I remember going to the place. It wasn't Alice's Restaurant anymore, but it was, the building was still there, so that was very cool. But yeah, that was great. Very important. And it's a fun song. It's a funky story, but keep in mind too, it's about draft resistance, right? So there's more to it. And the state, right? The state puts you in jail for littering, right? It's a great line. What'd you get? I didn't get nothing. I had to pay $50 and pick up all the garbage.
Yeah, exactly. It's important. We have a couple of overarching themes in the Green and Red podcast. And one is this theme of anti-authoritarianism or resistance to the state. Is that one of our critiques of liberals and Democrats is that they embrace the state. They want to lock people up. They want to fight wars in Ukraine, and they want to give money to the Israelis to commit a genocide. And one of our overarching themes that we strive to bring back into left discussion and left circles is anti-authoritarian resistance to the state. And it's an ongoing theme that we've had in the show the entire time, and it's been more prevalent this year than ever.
Yeah. And again, how many times have we said this? It's a theme that the right wing picked up on. Yeah, the liberals, the Democrats, whatever you want to call them, they are now that they own all that, right? They own the state, and they own the repression and all that too. Yeah, it's bad. And I see some lefties I think are somewhat dismissive of Trump. I'm not. Guy scares me. I think he's gonna. I'm not personally, but I think he's gonna harm a lot of people, right? Although, going back to the theme of you could find your dick in the dark, they're not a real crack. It's not a crack team. It's not a really high-end brains competent organization. Hopefully, and they're fighting among themselves right now.
At least we got that going for us.
Isn't it amazing that we have these debates about immigration and all these horrible, hysterical, alarmist stories, and now the debate revolves around Elon Musk and H-1B visas, right? It's such a screwed up country. And the Democratic Party, their policy now, I think, is just to let Trump do whatever he wants. It's going to be interesting. And Green and Red will be the center of resistance in 2025. I can guarantee that. I am saying that now. We are the center of resistance in 2025.
So we'll be spreading the good word with lots of organizers and activists and historians and journalists and everything else, just like we have the last almost 5 years ago. And we'll have our 5th anniversary in a couple of months as well.
Yeah. Something you mentioned, or maybe before the show, we were talking about some of the kind of notables this year, and the magazines that everybody give out their like People of the Year awards. And one of the big stories this year is media capitulation to Trump, right? Mm-hmm. Time magazine gives him Person of the Year, and ABC gives him $15 million, and Jeff Bezos is kissing his ass and all this kind of stuff.
Washington Post and LA Times refused to endorse anybody.
And I think it's more important than ever that to have these kind of other forms of reasons out there. But when we talk about kind of person of the year kind of stuff, and you've mentioned a couple names already, but Aaron Bushnell is clearly one. Hind Rajab, who's become a symbol of the genocide in Gaza. So there are people out there doing something. It's difficult. You want to balance.
Rafit Afar.
Yeah, you don't want to lie to people and say, oh, everything's going to be fine. But at the same time, there is reason and a need to have hope. And there are people resisting, and it's dark, and I don't know what's going to happen or what we're going to see. But at this point, you got to do it. And it can be, you do as much as you can. I can't do what I did 30 years ago. I'm old, so I get it, but you have to do something. And that's really critical. And don't let the Democratic Party talk you out of it.
Yep. I'm gonna wrap with a quote on that and then do our usual outro. Yeah. Which is a quote from Joe Hill. I was looking for something to close the year out with. I want you to remember what was good in me, not what was awful. The people you love should be allowed to keep the worst to themselves. It's important words going forward.
It's been a year, and I wish I could say, oh, 2025 is going to get better, but I can't. So we'll see where one old and addled president is stepping out and a new, even more addled and sociopathic president is stepping in. It's bleak. The world is, and this is happening all over, Milei and the far right in Germany. So we've got our work cut out for us. But try to find a little joy amid the madness. I sound like Kamala Harris now, right?
Joy.
No, but I wouldn't run a campaign based on joy. I think like healthcare is more important than joy.
Yeah.
Joy ain't gonna fix you if you're sick, but you need to try to keep somewhat of an even keel. Cause trouble and send us a few bucks and we'll give you some presents, right? Yep. And this is really cool if you're interested in Vietnam. But as I always point out, if you want to take on the Kennedy conspiracy people who are immune to evidence and facts anyway, but there's some really good stuff in here about that as well. Plus, and it's also really good on civil military relations, which is going to become more important because Trump is going to war against the military. Of course he is, right?
Yep. Yeah. So folks, if you want any of our merchandise, email us at greenredpodcast@gmail.com. If you like what you're hearing, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. If you want to help us out on with the audio platforms or listen to the audio platforms, give us a rate and a review. And then it's the end of the year, so make a donation at greenredpodcast.com or .org and hit that support button, or become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. Also want to thank all of the recent donors and all the recent new patrons. We've gotten a number of new folks lately and want to just shout out all of those supporters as well. So in gratitude, signing off in 2024, everybody make a lot of trouble and misbehave, and we'll be back in 2025.
Many's the time I've been mistaken, and many times confused. Yes, and I've often felt forsaken, and certainly misused. Oh, but I'm alright, I'm just weary to my bones. Still, you don't expect to be bright and bon vivant so far away from home, so far away from home. I don't know a soul who's not been battered. I don't have a friend who feels at ease.